All right, welcome to the Learning Library. Here we're going to be listening to Culture of Critique by Dr. Kevin MacDonald. I want to make it clear that, again, I do not have Dr. MacDonald's permission to do this book. In order for me to legally be able to do this without having this taken down, this is going to be technically an audiobook with commentary. I am making commentary on the book. So, here we go, starting Chapter 2, the Boasian School of Anthropology and a Decline of Darwinism in the Social Sciences. So it starts with a quote, "If we were to treat Margaret Mead's coming of age in Samoa as utopia, not as ethnography, then we would understand it better and save a lot of pointless debate." That's by Robin Fox, 1989. Several writers have commented on the radical changes that occurred in the goals and methods of the social sciences consequent to the entry of Jews to these fields. Degler notes that the shift away from Darwinism as the fundamental paradigm of the social sciences resulted from an ideological shift rather than from the emergence of any new empirical data. He also notes that Jewish intellectuals have been instrumental in the decline of Darwinism and other biological perspectives in America social science since the 1930s. The opposition of Jewish intellectuals to Darwinism has been long noticed. In sociology, the advent of Jewish intellectuals in the pre-World War II period resulted in a level of politicization unknown to sociology's founding fathers. It is not only that the names of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim replaced those of Charles Darwin and Herbert Spencer, but also that the sense of America as a consensual experience gave way to a sense of America as a series of conflicting definitions. In post-World War II period, sociology, quote, became populated by Jews to such a degree that jokes abounded. One did not need a synagogue, as the minyan, which is in their terms means the minimum number of Jews required for a communal religious service, was to be found in sociology departments. Or, one did not need sociology of Jewish life, since the two had become synonymous, unquote, and that's Horowitz 1993 being cited here. Indeed, the ethnic conflict within American sociology parallels to a remarkable degree the ethnic conflict in American anthropology that is a theme of this chapter. Here the conflict was played out between leftist social scientists and an old line, empirically oriented Protestant establishment that was eventually eclipsed. Quote, "American sociology has struggled with the contrary claims of those afflicted with physics, envy, and researchers, more engaged in the dilemmas of society. In that struggle, Midwestern Protestant mandarins of positivist science often came into conflict with East Coast Jews, who in turn wrestled with their own Marxist commitments. Great quantitative researchers from abroad, like Paul Lazarsfeld at Columbia, sought to disrupt the complacency of native bee encounters." That's quoting Senate 1995, unquote. This chapter will emphasize the ethnopolitical agenda of Franz Boas, but it is worth mentioning the work of Franco-Jewish structural anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, because he appears to be as similarly motivated, although the French structuralist movement as a whole cannot be viewed as a Jewish intellectual movement. Lévi-Strauss interacted extensively with Boas and acknowledged his influence. In turn, Lévi-Strauss was very influential in France. Dawsey, describing him as the common father of Michel Foucault, Louis Althusser, Roland Barthes, and Jacques Lacan. He had a strong Jewish identity and a deep concern with anti-Semitism. In response to an assertion that he was the very picture of a Jewish intellectual, Lévi-Strauss stated, quote, "Certain mental attitudes are perhaps more common among Jews than elsewhere. Attitudes that come from the profound feeling of belonging to a national community. All the while knowing that in the midst of this community there are people, fewer and fewer of them, I admit, who reject you. One keeps one's sensitivity attuned, accompanied by the irrational feeling that in all circumstances one has to do a bit more than other people to disarm potential critics." Unquote. Like many Jewish intellectuals discussed here, Levi-Strauss's writings were aimed at enshrining cultural differences and subverting the universalism of the West, a position that validates the position of Judaism as a non-assimilating group. Like Boas, Levi-Strauss rejected biological and evolutionary theories. He theorized that cultures, like languages, were arbitrary collections of symbols with no natural relationships to their referents. Levi-Strauss rejected Western modernization theory in favor of the idea that there were no superior species. The role of the anthropologist was to be a natural subversive or convinced opponent of traditional usage. In Western societies, while respecting and even romanticizing the virtues of non-Western societies, Western universalism and the idea of human rights were viewed as masks for ethnocentrism, colonialism, and genocide. Levi-Strauss's most significant works were all published during the This is a quote. Levi-Strauss's most significant works were all published during the breakup of the French colonial empire and contributed enormously to the way it was understood by intellectuals. His elegant writings worked as an aesthetic transformation on his readers, who were suddenly made to feel ashamed to be Europeans. He evoked the beauty, dignity, and irreducible strangeness of the Third World, cultures that were simply trying to preserve their difference. His writings would soon feed to the suspicion of the New Left, that all the universal ideas to which Europe claimed allegiance, reason, science, progress, liberal democracy, were culturally specific weapons fashioned to rob non-European other of his difference. Unquote. Degler emphasizes the role of Franz Boas in the anti-Darwinian transformation of American social science. Boas' influence upon American social scientists in matters of race can hardly be exaggerated. Boas engaged in a lifelong assault on the idea that race was a primary source of differences to be found in the mental or social capabilities of human groups. He accompanied his mission largely through the ceaseless, almost relentless articulation of the concept of culture. Boas, quote, almost single-handedly developed in America the concept of culture, which, like a powerful solvent, would in time expunge race from the literature of social science, unquote. And we have another quote here. Boas did not arrive at the position from a disinterested scientific inquiry into a vexed, if controversial, question. There is no doubt he had a deep interest in collecting evidence and designing arguments that would rebut or refute an ideological outlook, racism, which he considered restrictive upon individuals and undesirable for society. There is a persistent interest in pressing his social values upon the profession and the public, unquote. As Frank points out, the preponderance of Jewish intellectuals, and this is a quote, in the early years of Boasian anthropology and the Jewish identities of anthropologists in subsequent generations, has been downplayed in standard histories of the discipline, unquote. Jewish identifications in the pursuit of perceived Jewish interests, particularly in advancing an ideology of cultural pluralism as a model for Western societies, has been the invisible subject of American anthropology. Invisible because the ethnic identifications and ethnic interests of its advocates have been masked by a language of science in which such identifications and interests were publicly illegitimate. Boas was reared in a Jewish liberal family. Boas was reared in a Jewish liberal family in which the revolutionary ideals of 1848 remained influential. He developed a left liberal posture which is at once scientific and political. Boas married within his ethnic group and was intensely concerned with anti-Semitism from an early period in his life. Alfred Kroeber recounted a story, quote, which Boas is said to have revealed confidentially, but which cannot be vouched for, that on hearing an anti-Semitic insult in a public cafe, he threw the speakers out of doors and was challenged. Next morning, his adversary offered to to apologize, but Boas insisted that the duel be gone through with. The tale absolutely fits the character of the man as we know him in America, unquote. In a comment that says much about Boas's Jewish identification, as well as his view on Gentiles, Boas stated in response to a question regarding how he could have professional dealings with anti-Semites such as Charles Davenport, quote, "If we Jews had to choose to work with Gentiles certified to be 100% free of anti-Semitism, who could we ever really work with?" Unquote. Moreover, as has been common among Jewish intellectuals in several historical eras, Boas was deeply alienated from and hostile towards Gentile culture, particularly the cultural ideal of the Prussian aristocracy. When Margaret Mead wanted to persuade Boas to let her pursue her research in South Sea Islands, quote, "She hit upon a sure way of getting him to change his mind. I knew there was one thing that mattered more to Boas than the direction taken by anthropological research. This was that he should behave like a liberal, democratic, modern man, not like a Prussian autocrat. The ploy worked because she had indeed uncovered the heart of his personal values." Unquote. I conclude that Boas had a strong Jewish identification, that he was deeply concerned about anti-Semitism. On the basis of the following, it is reasonable to suppose that his concern with anti-Semitism was a major influence in the development of American anthropology. Indeed, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that ethnic conflict played a major role in the development of American anthropology. Boas's views conflicted with the then prevalent idea that cultures had evolved in a series of developmental stages labeled savagery, barbarism, and civilization. The stages were associated with racial differences, and modern European culture was at the highest level of this gradation. Wolff describes the attack of the Boasians as calling into question, quote, "the moral and political monopoly of a Gentile elite, which had justified its rule with the claim that their superior virtue was the outcome of the evolutionary process," unquote. Boas's theories were also meant to counter the racialist theories of Houston Stewart Chamberlain and American eugenicists like Madison Grant, whose book, Passing of the Great Race, was highly critical of Boas's research on environmental influences on skull size. The result was that, quote, "in message and purpose, Boas's anthropology was an explicitly anti-racist science," unquote. Grant characterized Jewish immigrants as ruthlessly self-interested, whereas American Nordics were committing racial suicide and also allowing themselves to be elbowed out of their own land. Grant also believed Jews were engaged in a campaign to discredit racial research. Quote, "It is well nigh impossible to publish in the American newspaper any reflection upon certain religions or races which are hysterically sensitive even when mentioned by name. Abroad, conditions are fully as bad, and we have the authority of one of the most eminent anthropologists in France, and the collection of anthropological measurements and data among French recruits at the outbreak of the Great War was prevented by Jewish influence, which aimed to suppress any suggestion of racial differentiation in France." Unquote. An important technique of the Boasian school was to cast doubt on general theories of human evolution, such as those implying developmental sequences, by emphasizing the vast diversity and chaotic minuet of human behavior, as well as the relativism of standards of cultural evaluation. The Boasians argued that general theories of cultural evolution must await a detailed cataloging of cultural diversity, but in fact no general theories emerged from this body of research in the ensuing half-century of its dominance of the profession. Because of its rejection of fundamental scientific activities, such as generalization and classification, Boasian anthropology may thus be characterized more as an anti-theory than a theory of human culture. Boas also opposed research on human genetics, what Derek Freeman terms his obscurantist antipathy to genetics. Boas and his students were intensely concerned with pushing an ideological agenda within the American anthropological profession. Boas and his associates had a sense of group identity, a commitment to a common viewpoint, and an agenda to dominate the institutional structure of anthropology. They were a compact group with a clear intellectual and political agenda, rather than individualist seekers of disinterested truth. The defeat of the Darwinians, quote, had not happened without considerable extortion of every mother's son, standing for the right, nor had it been accomplished without some rather strong pressure applied to both staunch friends and to the weaker brethren, often by the sheer force of Boas's personality, unquote. By 1915, the Boasians controlled the American Anthropological Association and held a 2/3 majority on its executive board. In 1919, Boas could state that most of the, quote, most of the anthropological work done at the present time in the United States, unquote, was done by students at Columbia. By 1926, every major department of anthropology was headed by Boas's students, the majority of whom were Jewish. His protege, Melville Herskovits, noted that the 4 decades of the tenure of Boas's professorship at Columbia gave a continuity to his teaching that permitted him to develop students who eventually made up the greater part of the significant professional core of American anthropologists, and who came to man and direct most of the major departments of anthropology in the United States. In their turn, they trained the students who have continued a tradition in which their teachers were trained. According to Leslie White, Boas's most influential students were Ruth Benedict, Alexander Goldenweiser, Melville Herskovits, Alfred Kroeber, Robert Lowy, Margaret Mead, Paul Radin, Edward Sapir, and Leslie Spear. All of this small group of scholars gathered around their leader were Jews, with the exceptions of Kroeber, Benedict, and Mead. Frank also mentioned several other prominent first-generation Jewish students of Boas: Alexander Lesser, Ruth Bunzel, Jean Regina Weltfish, Esther Goldfrank, and Ruth Landis. Sapir's family led the pogroms in Russia for New York, where Yiddish was his first language. Although not religious, he took an increasing interest in Jewish topics early in his career and later became engaged in Jewish activism, particularly in establishing a prominent center for Jewish learning in Lithuania. Ruth Land's background also shows the ethnic nexus of the Boasian movement. Her family was prominent in the Jewish leftist subculture of Brooklyn, and she was introduced to Boas by Alexander Goldenweiser, a close friend of her father and another of Boas's prominent students. In contrast to the ideological and political basis of Boas's motivation, Kroeber's militant environmentalism in defense of the culture concept was entirely theoretical and professional. Neither his private nor his public writings reflect the attention to public policy questions regarding blacks or the general question of race in American life that are so conspicuous in Boas's professional correspondence and publications. Kroeber rejected race as an analytical category as forthrightly and thoroughly as Boas, but he reached that position primarily through theory rather than ideology. Kroeber argued that, quote, "Our business is to promote anthropology rather than to wage battles on behalf of tolerance in other fields," unquote. Ashley Montagu was another influential student of Boas. Montagu, whose original name was Israel Ehrenberg, was a highly visible crusader in the battle against the idea of racial differences in mental capacities. He was also highly conscious of being Jewish, stating on one occasion, quote, "If you are brought up a Jew, you know that all non-Jews are anti-Semitic. I think it is a good working hypothesis," unquote. Montagu asserted that race is socially constructed myth. Humans are innately cooperative, not innately aggressive, and there is a universal brotherhood among humans, a highly problematic idea for many in the wake of World War II. Mention also should be made of Otto Kleinberg, a professor of psychology at Columbia. Kleinberg was tireless and ingenious in his arguments against the reality of racial differences. He came under the influence of Boas at Columbia and dedicated his 1935 Race Differences to him. Kleinberg, quote, "made it his business to do for psychology what his friend and colleague at Columbia, Boas, had done for anthropology, to rid his discipline of racial explanations for human social differences," unquote. And that's Degler in 1991. It is interesting in this regard that the members of the Boasian school who achieved the greatest public renown were two Gentiles, Benedict and Meade. As in several other prominent historical cases, Gentiles became the publicly visible spokespersons for a movement dominated by Jews. Indeed, like Freud, Boas recruited Gentiles into his movement out of concern, quote, that his Jewishness would make his science appear partisan and thus compromised, unquote. Boas devised Margaret Mead's classic study in adolescence in Samoa with an eye to its usefulness in the nature-nurture debate raging at the time. The result of this research was Coming of Age in Samoa, a book that revolutionized American anthropology in the direction of radical environmentalism. Its success stemmed ultimately from its promotion by Boas's students in departments of anthropology at prominent American universities. This work and Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture were also widely influential among other social scientists, psychiatrists, and the public at large, so that, quote, by the middle of the 20th century, it was commonplace for educated Americans to refer to human differences in cultural terms, and to say that modern science has shown that all human races are equal, unquote. Boas rarely cited works of people outside his group except to disparage them, whereas with Meade and Benedict's work, he strenuously promoted and cited the works of people within the in-group. The Boasian school of anthropology thus came to assemble in a microcosm key features of Judaism as a highly collectivist group evolutionary strategy, a high level of in-group identification, exclusionary policies, and cohesiveness in pursuit of common interests. Boasian anthropology, at least during Boas's lifetime, also resembled traditional Judaism in another critical matter. It was highly authoritarian and intolerant of dissent. As in the case of Freud, Boas was a patriarchal father figure, strongly supporting those who agreed with him and excluding those who did not. Alfred Kroeber regarded Boas as a true patriarch who functioned as a powerful father figure, cherishing and supporting those with whom he identified in the degree that he felt were genuinely identifying with him, but as regard others, aloof and probably fundamentally indifferent, wholly hostile if the occasion demanded it. Quote, Boas has all the attributes of the head of a cult, a revered charismatic teacher and master, literally worshipped by disciples whose permanent loyalty has been effectively established, unquote. As in the case of Freud, in the eyes of his disciples, virtually everything Boas did was of monumental importance and justified placing him among the intellectual giants of all time. Like Freud, Boas did not tolerate theoretical or ideological differences with his students. Individuals who disagreed with the leader or had personality clashes with him, such as Clark Whistler and Rolf Linton, were simply excluded from the movement. White represents the exclusion of Whistler and Linton as having ethnic overtones. Both were Gentiles. White also suggests that George A. Dorsey's status as a Gentile was relevant to his exclusion from the Boas group, despite Dorsey's intensive efforts to be a member. Kroeber describes how George A. Dorsey, quote, an American-born Gentile and a Ph.D. from Harvard, tried to gain admittance to the select group but failed. As an aspect of this authoritarianism, Boas was instrumental in completely suppressing evolutionary theory and anthropology. Boas was the quintessential skeptic and an ardent defender of methodological rigor when it came to theories of cultural evolution and genetic influences on individual differences, yet the burden of proof rested lightly upon Boas's own shoulders, unquote. Although Boas made his conjectures in a very dogmatic manner, his historical reconstructions are inferences, guesses, and unsupported assertions ranging from the possible to the preposterous. Almost none is verifiable. An unrelenting foe of generalization and theory construction, Boas nevertheless completely accepted generalization and theory construction. Boas never completely accepted the absolute generalization at which Margaret Mead had arrived after probing for a few months into adolescent behavior in Samoa, even though Mead's results were contrary to previous research in the area. Moreover, Boas uncritically allowed Bruce Benedict to distort his own data on the Kwakiutl. The entire enterprise may thus be characterized as a highly authoritarian political movement centered around a charismatic leader. The results extraordinarily successful. The profession as a whole was united by a single national organization of academically oriented anthropologists. By and large, they shared a common misunderstanding of the fundamental significance of the historically conditioned variety of human cultures in the determination of human behavior. Research on racial differences ceased, and the profession completely excluded eugenicists and racial theorists like Madison Grant and Charles Davenport. By the mid-1930s, Boasian view of the cultural determination of human behavior had a strong influence on social scientists generally. The followers of Boas also eventually became some of the most influential academic supporters of psychoanalysis. Marvin Harris notes that psychoanalysis was adopted by the Boasian school because of its utility as a critique of Euro-American culture, and indeed, as we shall see in later chapters, psychoanalysis is an ideal vehicle of cultural critique. In the hands of the Boasian school, psychoanalysis was completely stripped of its evolutionary associations, and there was a much greater accommodation to the importance of cultural variables. Cultural critique was also an important aspect of the Boasian school. Stocking shows that several prominent Boasians, including Robert Lowy and Edward Sapir, were involved in the cultural criticism of the 1920s, which centered around the perception of American culture as overtly homogeneous, hypocritical, and emotionally and aesthetically repressive. Central to this program was creating ethnographies of idyllic cultures which were free of the negatively perceived traits that were attributed to Western culture. Among these Boasians, cultural criticism crystallized as an ideology of romantic primitivism, in which certain non-Western cultures epitomized the approved characteristics Western society should emulate. Cultural criticism was a central feature of the two most prominent Boasian ethnographies, Coming of Age in Samoa and Patterns of Culture. These works are not only erroneous, but systematically misrepresent key issues related to evolutionary perspectives on human behavior. For example, Benedict Zuni were being described as being free of war, homicide, and concerned with accumulation of wealth. Children were not disciplined. Sex was casual, with little concern for virginity, sexual possessiveness, or paternity confidence. Contemporary Western societies are, of course, the opposite of these idyllic paradises, and Benedict suggests that we should study such cultures in order to, quote, to pass judgment on the dominant traits of our own civilization, unquote. Mead's similar portrayal of the Samoans ignored her own evidence contrary to her thesis. Negatively perceived behaviors of Mead's Samoans, such as rape and concern for virginity, were attributed to Western influence. Both of these ethnographic accounts have been subjected to devastating criticisms. The picture of these societies that has emerged is far more compatible with evolutionary expectations than the societies depicted by Benedict and Mead. In the controversy surrounding Mead's work, some defenders of Mead have pointed to possible negative political implications of the demythologicalization of her work. The highly politicized context of the questions raised by this research thus continues unabated. Indeed, one consequence of the triumph of Boasians was that there was almost no research on warfare and violence among the peoples studied by anthropologists. Warfares and warriors were ignored, and cultures were conceived as consisting of myth-makers and gift-givers. Oran shows that Mead systematically ignored cases of rape, violence, revolution, and competition in her account of Samoa. Only 5 articles on the anthropology of war appeared during the 1950s. Revealingly, when Harry Turney High published his volume Primitive Warfare in 1949, documenting the universality of warfare and its oftentimes awesome savagery, the book was completely ignored by the anthropological profession. Another example of the exclusionary tactics used against dissenters among the Boasians, and characteristic of the other intellectual movements reviewed in this volume, as characteristic of the other intellectual movements reviewed in this volume as well. Turney High's massive data on non-Western peoples conflicted with the image of them favored by a highly politicized profession whose members simply excluded these data entirely from intellectual discourse. The result was a pacified past and an attitude of self-reproach, in which the behavior of primitive peoples were boulderized, while the behavior of which Europeans people was not only excoriated as uniquely evil, but also as responsible for all extant examples of warfare among primitive peoples. From this perspective, it is only the fundamental inadequacy of European culture that prevents an idyllic world free from between-group conflict. The reality, of course, is far different. Warfare was and remains a recurrent phenomena among pre-state societies. Surveys indicate over 90% of societies engage in warfare, the great majority engaging in military activities at least once per year. Moreover, quote, whenever modern humans appear on the scene, definitive evidence of homicidal violence becomes more common, given a significant number of burials. Because of its frequency and the seriousness of its consequences, primitive warfare was more deadly than civilized warfare. Most adult males in primitive and prehistoric societies engaged in warfare and saw combat repeatedly in a lifetime. Unquote. And this is Keeley, 1996. And now we are at a new part of the chapter called Beyond Boaz, Recent Examples of Jewish Political Agendas Influencing Social Science Research. Jewish influence on the social sciences has extended far beyond Boaz and the American Anthropological Association. Hollinger notes, the transformation of the ethno-religious demography of American academic life by Jews in a period from 1930s to the 1960s, as well as the Jewish influence on trends towards the secularization of American society, and in advancing an ideal of cosmopolitanism. As early as the early 1940s, this transformation resulted in a, quote, a secular, increasingly Jewish, decidedly left-of-center intelligentsia based largely, but not exclusively, in the disciplinary communities of philosophy and the social sciences. By 1968, Jews constituted 20% of the faculty of elite American colleges and universities and constituted 30% of the most liberal faculty. At the time, Jews representing less than 3% of the population constituted 25% of the social science faculty at elite universities and 40% of the liberal faculty, who published most. Jewish academics were also far more likely to support progressive or communist parties from the 1930s to the 1950s. In 1948, 30% of the Jewish faculty voted for the Progressive Party, compared to less than 5% for Gentile faculty. And now I want to comment here that there is a Ron's Unz article you can read that's called The Myth of Meritocracy, where he goes into detail on how Harvard, being the most recognizable elite institution that we have in terms of academia, their graduate and PhD class is, according to Hillel, which is a Jewish university organization, according to their website, the percentage of Jews in these master and PhD programs are at 67%. It's 67% Jewish. And you got to remember, Jews are at the very most 3% of the American population. So that's another important thing to note as well here. It appears that affirmative action is a policy that has directly benefited Jews at the detriment of white people. And there's even a survey one can look up where all races of people are asked, would you support affirmative action if it meant it directly harmed white people? And the group that scored highest in saying yes to this question were Jews. In fact, even blacks and Hispanics scored significantly lower when you added in that white people would be negatively impacted as a result of this. So yeah, that's my 2 cents here, and we're going to continue. Boas, who was a socialist, is a good example of the leftist bent of Jewish social scientists, and many of his followers were political radicals. Similar associations are apparent in the psychoanalytic movement and the Frankfurt School of Social Research, as well as among several critics of sociobiology mentioned in this chapter. The attraction of Jewish intellectuals to the left is a general phenomenon and has typically co-occurred with a strong Jewish identity and sense of pursuing specific Jewish interests. Stephen Jay Gould and Leon Kamen are good examples of these trends. Gould's perspective on social influences on evolutionary theory was mentioned in Chapter 5, and Gould himself would appear to be a prime example of this conflation of personal and ethnopolitical interests in a construction of science. Gould has been an ardent, highly publicized opponent of evolutionary approaches to human behavior. Like many of the other prominent critics of sociobiology, Gould is Jewish, and Michael Ruse notes that a very prominent theme of Gould's, the mismeasure of man, was how hereditarian views on intelligence have been used by Teutonic supremacists to discriminate against Jews early in the century. Gould's views on the IQ debates of the 1920s and their link to the immigration issue, and eventually the Holocaust, bear scrutiny. They illustrate how skill as a propagandist and ethnic activist can be combined with a highly physical and prestigious academic position to have a major influence on public attitudes in an area of research with great implications for public society. Ruse points out that Gould's book was very passionately written and was widely criticized by historians of psychology, suggesting that Gould had allowed his feelings about anti-Semitism to color his scientific writings on genetic influences on individual differences in intelligence. Ruse goes on as follows, quote, "It does not seem to me entirely implausible to suggest that Gould's passion against human sociobiology was linked to the fear that it was yet another tool which could be used for anti-Semitic purposes. I did ask Gould about this one. He did not entirely repudiate the idea, but inclined to think that the opposition stemmed more from Marxism, as it so contingently happens. Most American Marxists are from Eastern European Jewish families. Perhaps both factors were involved, unquote. Gold's comments highlight the fact that the role of Jewish academics in opposing Darwinian approaches to human behavior has often co-occurred with a strong commitment to a leftist political agenda. Indeed, Gold had acknowledged that his theory of evolution as punctuated equilibria was attracted to him as a Marxist because it posited periodic revolutionary upheavals in evolution rather than conservative gradualist change. Gold learned his Marxism at his daddy's knee, indicating that he grew up as a part of a Jewish Marxist subculture discussed in Chapter 3. In a recent article, Gold reminisces fondly about the Jewish Forward, a politically radical but also ethnically conscious Yiddish newspaper, stating that he recalls that many of his relatives bought the newspaper daily. As Arthur Hertzberg notes, quote, "Those who read the Forward knew that the commitment of Jews to remain Jewish was beyond question and discussion," unquote. Although Gold's family did not practice Jewish religious rituals, his family embraced Jewish culture. A common ingredient in Jewish culture is a sense of historical prevalence of anti-Semitism, and Gold's sense of historical oppression of Jews comes out in his recent review of the Bell Curve, where he rejects Herrnstein and Murray's vision of a socially cohesive society where everyone has a valued role to play. Quote, "They," referring to Herrnstein and Murray, "have forgotten about the town Jew and the dwellers on the other side of the tracks in many of these idyllic villages," unquote. Clearly, Gold is blaming historical Western societies for failing to include Jews in their social structures of hierarchic harmony and social cohesiveness. In Chapter 8, I will return to the issue of the incompatibility of Judaism with this quintessential Western form of social structure. Kamen and Gold have quite similar backgrounds in the leftist Jewish subculture, described more fully in Chapter 3, and they share with many American Jews a strong personal animosity to the immigration legislation of the 1920s. Kamen, the son of an immigrant rabbi from Poland, acknowledges that, quote, "the experience growing up Jewish in a small and predominantly Christian town strongly sensitized him to the power of the social environment in shaping personality," unquote. A comment that also suggests that Kamen grew up with a strong Jewish identity. While at Harvard, Kamen joined the Communist Party and became the New England editor of the party's newspaper. After resigning from the party, he became a target of Joseph McCarthy's Senate subcommittee hearings in 1953. Kamen was charged and acquitted on technical grounds of charges of criminal contempt of Congress for failing to answer all of the questions of the subcommittee. Fancher describes Kamen's work on IQ as having little pretense to objectivity, and suggests a link between Kamen's background and his position on IQ. Quote, "No doubt reflecting that his own Middle European family, and I suppose other Jews, could have been excluded by the restrictive immigration laws, Kamen concluded that an arrogant and unfounded assumption of IQ heritability had helped produce an unjust social policy of the 1920s, unquote. Kamen and Gold have been in the forefront of spreading disinformation about the role of IQ testing in the immigration debates of the 1920s. Snyderman and Herrnstein show that Kamen and Gold misrepresented H. Goddard's study of the IQ of Jewish immigrants as indicating that, quote, 83% of Jews, 80% of Hungarians, and 79% of the Italians, and 87% of the Russians were feeble-minded, unquote. As Snyderman and Herrnstein note, the fact that is most often cited as evidence of IQ's nativistic bias was not based on IQ scores, not taken even by its discoverer as accurately representative of immigrants or as a clean measure of inherited abilities, and it used a test that was known at the time to exaggerate feeble-mindedness in adult population of all sorts. Indeed, Goddard noted that we have no data on this point, but indirectly we may argue that it is far more probable that their condition is due to the environment than it is to heredity. He cited his own work indicating that immigrants accounted for only 4.5% of inmates in institutions for the feeble-minded. Degler finds that Gould engaged in a simple-minded pursuit of Goddard, presenting a false picture of Goddard as a rigid hereditarian or elitist. Gould ignored Goddard's doubts and qualifications, as well as his statements on the importance of the environment. There can be little doubt that Gould was engaging in scholarly fraud in this endeavor. Degler notes that Gould quoted Goddard just prior to the following passage, and was thus aware that Goddard was far from rigid in his beliefs on the nature of feeble-mindedness. Quote, "Even now we are far from believing the case settled. The problem is too deep to be thus easily disposed of." Nevertheless, Gould chose to ignore this passage. Gould also ignored Degler's comments in his 1996 revision of the mismeasure of man, described more fully below. Moreover, Kamen and Gould present a highly exaggerated and largely false account of the general attitudes of the testing community on the subject of ethnic group differences in intelligence, as well as the role of IQ testing in the congressional debates of the period. The latter point confirmed in my own reading of the debates. Indeed, IQ testing was never mentioned in either the House Majority Report or the Minority Report. The Minority Report was written and signed by two Jewish congressmen, Representatives Dickstein and Sabbath, who led the battle against restrictionism. Contrary to Gould's claim that congressional debates leading to the passage of the Immigration Act of 1924 continually invoked the Army IQ test data, Snyderman and Herrnstein note that, quote, "There is no mention of the intelligence testing in the Act. Test results on immigrants appear only briefly in the committee hearings and are then largely ignored or criticized, and they are brought up only once in over 600 pages of congressional floor debate, where they are subjected to further criticism without rejoinder. None of the major contemporary figures in testing were called to testify, nor were their writings inserted into the legislative record," unquote. Also, as Samuelson points out, the drive to restrict immigration originated long before IQ testing came into existence, and restriction was favored by a variety of groups, including organized labor, for reasons other than those related to race and IQ, including especially the fairness of maintaining the ethnic status quo in the United States. Samuelson describes several other areas of Kamen's scholarly malfeasance, most notably his defamatory discussions of Goddard. Lewis M. Terman and Robert M. Yerkes, in which these pioneers of mental testing are portrayed as allowing political beliefs to color their data. Terman, for example, found that Asians were not inferior to Caucasians, results he reasonably interpreted as indicating the inadequacy of cultural explanations. These findings are compatible with contemporary data. Jews were also overrepresented in Terman's study of gifted children, a result that was trumpeted at the Jewish press at the time. An example being the American Hebrew, talking about this on July 13, 1923, and is compatible with contemporary data. Both findings are contrary to the theory of Nordic superiority. Kamen also concluded that the use of the 1890 census had only one purpose, acknowledged the bill's supporters. The new immigration had begun after 1890, and the law was designed to exclude the biologically inferior peoples of southeastern Europe. This is a very tendacious interpretation of the motives of the restrictionists. As discussed in Chapter 7, the 1890 census of the foreign-born was used because the percentage of foreign-born ethnic groups in 1890 approximated the proportion of these groups in the general populations as of 1920. The principal argument of the restrictionists was the use of the 1890 census was fair to all ethnic groups. So going into commentary mode here, it would appear that the immigration restrictionists looked at how the census looked in 1890 and came to the conclusion that, look, this is how the ethnic makeup of America has been for a long time. Let's keep it this way. We'll still allow other people to come in, but we'll allow people who are of the ethnicity of the majority population already to be the main group of immigrants so that we keep the demographic trends the same and we don't have to worry about one group, the main group becoming a minority and a new group becoming the majority. These are more generous proposals than what Israel currently has now, and you're going to rarely see one of these people criticize Israel's immigration policies openly. And that's basically all I had to say on that, so let's continue. This false picture of the 1920s debates was then used by Gold, Kamen, and others to argue that the overtly racist Immigration Act of 1924 was passed because of racist bias emanating from the IQ testing community, and that this law was a primary cause of the death of the Jews in the Holocaust. Thus, Kamen concluded that, quote, the law for which the science of mental testing may claim substantial credit resulted in the deaths of literally hundreds of thousands of victims of the Nazi biological terror theorists. The victims were denied admission to the United States because of the German quota was filled, unquote. Kamen's portrayal of early 20th century intelligence testing became received wisdom, appearing repeatedly in newspapers, popular magazines, court decisions, and occasionally even scholarly publications. My own introduction to Kamen's ideas came from reading a popular textbook on developmental psychology I was using in my teaching. Similarly, Gold proposes a link between hereditary views on IQ and the 1924 U.S. immigration law that restricted immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe and biased immigration in favor of the peoples of Northwestern Europe. The 1924 immigration law is then linked to the Holocaust. Quote, the quotas slowed down immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe to a trickle. Throughout the 1930s, Jewish refugees, anticipating the Holocaust, sought to emigrate, but were not admitted. The legal quotas and continuing eugenical propaganda barred them even in years when inflated quotas for Western and Northern Europeans were not filled. Chase has estimated that the quotas barred up to 6 million Southern, Central, and Eastern Europeans between 1924 and the outbreak of World War II. We know what happened to many who wished to leave, but had nowhere to go. The paths to destruction are often indirect, but ideas can be agents as sure as guns and bombs, unquote. Indeed, although there is no evidence that IQ testing or eugenic theories had anything more than a trivial influence on the 1924 immigration law, there is evidence that the law was perceived by Jews as directed against them. Moreover, concerns about Jews and their ultimate effect on American society may well have been a motive of some of the Gentiles favoring immigration restriction, including among the intellectuals Madison Grant and Charles Davenport. Because of his desire to counteract the publicity given to the bell curve, Gold reissued the Measure of Man in 1996 with a new introduction in which he states, quote, may I end up next to Judas, Iscariot, Brutus, and Cassius in the devil's mouth at the center of hell, if I ever fail to present my most honest assessment and best judgment of the evidence for empirical truth, unquote. Despite this pledge of scholarly objectivity, Gold took no steps to deal with the objections of his critics, exactly the type of behavior one expects in a propagandist rather than a scholar. The Snyderman and Herstein article, Samuelson's work, and Degler's book are not cited at all, and Gold does not retract his statement that IQ testing was a prominent feature of the congressional immigration debates of the 1920s. Perhaps most egregiously of all, Gold makes the amazing argument that he will continue to ignore all recent scholarship on IQ in favor of the older classical research because of the transient nature of contemporary scholarship. The argument is that there is no progress in IQ research, but only a recurrence of the same bad arguments, a comment that I doubt Gold would apply to any other area of science. Thus, Gold continues to denigrate studies linking brain size with IQ, despite a great deal of contrary research, both prior to and especially since his 1981 edition. Using magnetic resonance imaging to get a more accurate measure of brain size, modern research thus vindicates the discoveries of 19th-century pioneers like Paul Broca, Francis Galton, and Samuel George Morton, who were systematically defamed by Gold. However, as Rushton notes, Gold's revised edition apparently omitted his 1981 discussion of Arthur Jensen's research on the brain size IQ correlation because of the realization that the contemporary data are unequivocal in their support of a moderate association. Instead, in the 1996 edition, Gold reprints his approval of a 1971 review of the literature that concluded that there was no leadership. Gold's revision thus ignores 25 years of research, including Van Halen's paper on which Jensen's ideas were based. In his revision, Gold also does not discuss an article by J.S. Michael that shows that, contrary to Gold's claim, Samuel George Morton did not fudge his data on race differences in skull size, intentionally or otherwise. Moreover, although Morton's research was conducted with integrity, it concluded an error that actually favored a non-Caucasian group, an error that Gold failed to mention, while at the same time Gold himself made systematic errors and used arbitrarily chosen procedures in his calculations. And Gold did so in a manner that favored his own hypothesis that there are no racial differences in cranial capacity. Gold also failed to revise his definition of H. Goddard, in which he claimed that Goddard had doctored photographs of the famous Kallikak family to make them look mentally retarded and menacing. In his study, Goddard had compared the Kallikaks, who were the descendants of a tavern maid and an upstanding citizen, with the descendants of the same man and his wife. A subsequent study by Glenn and Ellis, appearing well before the revised edition, concluded, however, that these photographs are judged as appearing kind. To put it charitably, Gold's presuppositions about the malicious intentions of IQ researchers results in his over-attributing bias to others. Finally, in the 1996 revision, Gold failed to rebut arguments against his claim that general intelligence was nothing more than a statistical artifact. This is noteworthy because in his introduction to the 1996 edition, Gold is clearly apologetic about his lack of expertise as a historian of science or as a psychologist, but he does claim to be an expert in factor analysis. His failure to mount a defense against his scholarly critics is therefore another example of his intellectual dishonesty in the service of his ethno-political agenda. As the review of the 1996 edition by Rushton indicates, a great many other errors of commission and omission abound in Mismeasure of Man, all having to do with politically sensitive issues involving racial differences and sex differences in cognitive abilities. Gold has also strongly opposed the idea that there is progress in evolution, quite possibly because of his belief that such ideas among German evolutionists contributed to the rise of National Socialism. As recounted by Lewin, Gold acknowledges an ideological influence on his beliefs, but reiterates that his belief that the trends towards greater intelligence and larger brain size are not important in the overall scheme of evolution. However, Gold acknowledges there is a deeper issue at stake than whether all animal groups show this tendency. At the basis of this perspective is Gold's assertion that human consciousness, intelligence, and the general trend towards larger brain size in human evolution are mere accidents and did not contribute to Darwinian fitness or to the solution of adaptive problems in ancestral environments. His perspective is thus meant to be a skirmish in the nature-nurture debate over intelligence. In addition, Dennett's devastating analysis of the rhetorical devices used by Gold in his war against adaptationism leaves little doubt regarding the fundamental intellectual dishonesty of Gold's writings. Dennett implies that a non-scientific agenda motivates Gold, but stops short of attempting to analyze the reasons for this agenda. Gold himself recounts an incident in which the British biologist Arthur Kane, referring to Gold and Lewontin's famous anti-adaptationist paper, The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm, a critique of the adaptationist program, accused him of having betrayed the norms of science and intellectual decency by denying something that we knew to be true because he so disliked the political implications of an argument based upon it. The verdict must be that Gold has indeed fortified his membership in the ancient and universal company of scholars and will spend his afterlife in the devil's mouth at the center of hell. However, it is noteworthy that despite the widespread belief that Gold had a highly politicized agenda and is dishonest and self-serving as a scholar, the prominent evolutionary biologist John Maynard Smith notes that, quote, he has come to be seen by non-biologists as the preeminent evolutionary theorist. In contrast, the evolutionary biologists with whom I have worked with tend to see him as a man whose ideas are so confused as to hardly worth bothering with. All this would not matter if it were not that he is giving non-biologists a largely false picture of the state of evolutionary theory, unquote. Similarly, Steven Pinker, a prominent linguist and a major figure in the evolutionary psychologist movement, labels Gold's ideas on adaptationism as misguided and uninformed. He also takes Gold to task for failing to properly cite the widely known book of G.C. Williams and Donald Simmons, in which these authors have proposed non-adaptive explanations for some human behaviors, while nevertheless adopting an adaptationist perspective on human behavior generally. Gold has thus dishonestly taken credit for other ideas, while utilizing them in a wholly inappropriate manner to discredit the adaptationist program entirely. In an article entitled Homo Deceptus, Never Trust Jay Gold, journalist Robert Wright, author of The Moral Animal, makes the same charge in a debate over a flagrantly dishonest interpretation by Gold of the human psychology of sex differences. Wright notes that Gold, quote, has convinced the public he is not merely a great writer, but a great theorist of evolution. Yet among top-flight evolutionary biologists, Gold is considered a pest, not just a lightweight, but an actively muddled man who has warped the public's understanding of Darwinism, unquote. A false picture, perhaps, but one is without its usefulness in satisfying political and, I suppose, ethnic agendas. Another prominent biologist, John Alcock, provides an extended and, I think, accurate analysis of several aspects of Gold's rhetorical style, demonstrations of erudition, foreign phrases, poetry, irrelevant to the intellectual arguments, but widely regarded even by his critics, branding the opposition as with denigrating labels such as pop science, pop psychology, cardboard Darwinism, or fundamentalist Darwinians. Decries Gold's hyperbolic rhetoric, including his description of the ideas of evolutionary psychology as pathetic and egregiously simplistic, and his use of some of the 25 synonyms for fanatical, oversimplifying his opponent's positions in order to set up straw man arguments. The classic being labeling his opponents as genetic determinists, protecting his own position by making the illusory concessions to give the appearance of a fair-mindedness in the attempt to restrict debate, claiming the moral high ground, ignoring relevant data known to all in the scientific community, proposing non-adaptationist alternatives without attempting to test them, and ignoring data supporting adaptationist interpretations, arguing that proximate explanations render ultimate explanations unnecessary, unquote. The comments of Maynard Smith, Wright, and Alcock highlight the important issue that despite the scholarly community's widespread recognition of Gould's intellectual honesty, Gould has been highly publicized as a public spokesperson on issues related to evolution and intelligence. As Alcock notes, Gould, as a widely published Harvard professor, makes it respectable to be an anti-adaptationist, and I have noticed this effect not only among the educated public, but also among many academics outside the biological sciences. He has had access to highly prestigious intellectual forums, including a regular column in Natural History, along with the Richard C. Lewontin. He is often featured as a book reviewer in the New York Review of Books. This publication has been a long bastion of the intellectual left. In Chapter 4, I will discover the NYRB in promulgating psychoanalysis, and in Chapter 6, the NYRB is listed among journals of the New York intellectuals, a predominantly Jewish coterie that dominated intellectual discourse in the post-World War II era. The point here is that Gould's career of intellectual dishonesty has not existed in a vacuum, but has been part and parcel of a wide-ranging movement that has dominated the most prestigious intellectual arenas in the United States and the West. A movement that is here conceptualized as a facet of Judaism as among a group evolutionary strategy. On a more personal level, I clearly recall that one of the most noteworthy experiences in graduate school in the behavioral sciences was being exposed to the great instinct debate between the German ethologists Konrad Lorenz and Irenaeus Abel Ebsfeld versus several predominantly Jewish American developmental psychologists D.S. Lerman, J.S. Rosenblatt, T.C. Schneerle, H. Moltz, G. Gottlieb, and E. Tolbach. Lorenz's connections to National Socialism were a barely concealed aspect of this debate, and I remember feeling that I was witnessing some sort of ethnic warfare rather than a dispassionate scientific debate of the evidence. Indeed, the intense extra-scientific passions these issues raised in some participants were openly admitted towards the end of the extraordinary conflict. In his 1970 contribution, Learman stated, quote, "I should not point out irrational, emotion-laden arguments in Lorenz's reaction to criticism without acknowledging that, when I look over my 1953 critique of his theory, I perceive elements of hostility to which my target would have been bound to react. My critique does not now read to me like an analysis of scientific problem, with an evaluation of the contribution of a particular point of view, but rather like an assault upon a theoretical point of view, the writer of which assault was not interested in, pointing out what positive contributions that point of view had made," unquote. More recently, as the debate has shifted away from opposing human ethology towards attacks on human sociobiology, several of these developmental psychobiologists have also become prominent critics of sociobiology. This is not, of course, to deny the very important contributions of these developmental psychobiologists and their emphasis on the role of environment in behavioral development, a tradition that remains influential within developmental psychology in the writings of several theorists, including Alan Fogel, Richard Lerner, Arnold Samaroff, and Esther Thielen. Moreover, it must be recognized that several Jews have been important contributors to evolutionary thinking, as it applies to humans as well as human behavioral genetics, including Daniel Friedman, Richard Herrnstein, Seymour Itzoff, Erwin Silverman, Nancy Segal, Lionel Tiger, and Glenn Weisfield. Of course, non-Jews have been counted among the critics of evolutionary biological thinking. Nevertheless, the entire episode clearly indicates that there are often important human interests that involve Jewish identity and that influence scientific debate. The suggestion here is that one consequence of Judaism as a group evolutionary strategy has been to skew these debates in a manner that impeded progress in the biological and social sciences. Richard Lerner, in his Final Solutions, Biology, Prejudice, and Genocide, is perhaps the most egregious example of a scientist motivated to discredit evolutionary biological thinking because of putative links with anti-Semitism. Barry Mehler, a protege of Jerry Hirsch, is also explicit in making these linkages, but is far less prominent academically, and functions mainly as a publicist for these views in leftist intellectual media. Mehler graduated from Yeshiva University and organized a program, The Jewish Experience to America, in 1880 to 1975 at Washington University in St. Louis, suggesting a strong Jewish identification. Lerner is a prominent developmental psychologist, and his volume indicates an intense personal involvement directed at combating anti-Semitism by influencing theory in the behavioral sciences. Prior to discussing the explicit links between Lerner's theoretical perspective and his attempt to combat anti-Semitism, I will describe his theory and illustrate the type of strained thinking with which he has attempted to discredit the application of evolutionary thinking to human behavior. Central to this program is Lerner's rejection of biological determinism in favor of a dynamic, contextualist approach to human development. Lerner also rejects environmental determinism, but there is little discussion of the latter view because environmental determinism is perhaps less socially pernicious. In this regard, Lerner is surely wrong. A theory that there is no human nature would imply that humans could easily be programmed to accept all manner of exploitation, including slavery. From a radical environmentalist perspective, it should not matter how many societies are constructed, since people should be able to learn to accept any type of social structure. Women could easily be programmed to accept rape, and ethnic groups could be programmed to accept their own domination by other ethnic groups. The view that radical environmentalism is not socially pernicious also ignores the fact that the communist government of the Soviet Union murdered millions of its citizens and later engaged in officially sponsored anti-Semitism while committed to an ideology of radical environmentalism. Lerner's dynamic contextualism pays lip service to biological influences, while actually rendering them inconsequential and unanalyzable. This theory has strong roots in the developmental psychobiological tradition described above, and there are numerous references to these writers. The dynamic contextualist perspective conceptualizes development as a dialectical interaction between organism and environment. Biological influences are viewed as a reality, but they are ultimately unanalyzable, since they are viewed as being inextricably fused with environmental influences. The most notable conclusion is that any attempt to study genetic variation as an independently analyzable influence on individual differences. For a particularly egregious example embodying practically every possible misunderstanding of basic behavior genetic concepts, see Gold. It bears mentioning that dynamic contextualism and its emphasis on dialectical interaction between organism and environment bear more than a passing resemblance to Marxism. The foreword of Lerner's book was written by R.C. Lewontin, the Harvard population biologist who has engaged in a high-profile attempt to fuse science, leftist politics, and opposition to evolutionary and biological theorizing about human behavior. Lewontin was the first author of Not in Our Genes, a book that begins with a statement of the author's commitment to socialism, and among a great many other intellectual sins, continues the disinformation regarding the role of IQ testing in the immigration debates of the 1920s and its putative links to the Holocaust. Indeed, E.O. Wilson, whose synthetic volume Sociobiology, the New Synthesis, inaugurated the field of sociobiology, notes that, quote, without Lewontin, the sociobiology controversy would not have been so intense or attracted such widespread attention, unquote. In his foreword to Lerner's book, Lewontin states that developmental contextualism is the alternative to biological and cultural determinism. It is the statement of the developmental contextual view that is the important central point of final solutions, and is the full elaboration of the point of view that is a pressing program for social theory. Nowhere has this worldview been put more succinctly than in Marx's third thesis on Feuerbach. Lewontin goes on to quote a passage from Marx that does indeed express something like the fundamental idea of a developmental contextualism. Gould also has endorsed a Marxist dialectical perspective in the social sciences. Lerner devotes much of his book to showing that dynamic contextualism, because of its emphasis on plasticity, involves a politically unacceptable perspective on racial and sexual differences, as well as promising a hope for ending anti-Semitism. This type of messianic redemptionist attempt to develop a universalist theoretical framework within which Jewish-Gentile group differences are submerged in importance is a common feature of other predominantly Jewish movements in the 20th century, including radical political theories and psychoanalysis. The common theme is that these ideologies have been consistently promoted by individuals who, like Lerner, are self-consciously pursuing a Jewish ethnic and political agenda. However, the ideologies are advocated because of their universalist promise to lead humanity to a higher level of morality, a level of morality in which there is a continuity of Jewish group identity, but an eradication of anti-Semitism. As such, dynamic contextualism can be seen as one of the many post-Enlightenment attempts to reconcile Judaism with the modern world. There is no question that Lerner strongly believes in the moral imperative of his position, but his moral crusade has led him well beyond science in his attempts to discredit biological theories in the interest of combating anti-Semitism. Lerner co-authored an article in the journal Human Development directed at combating the influence of biological thinking in research on human development. My edited volume is prominently cited as an example of an evolutionary approach deriving from E.O. Wilson's work, and as a point of view that has, quote, found support and application, unquote. As their example of how this point of view has been supported and applied, Lerner and von I cite the work of J. Philippe Rushton on racial differences in RK reproductive lifestyles. The implication would appear to be that my edited volume was somehow a basis of Rushton's work. This is inaccurate, since 1. The volume never mentioned in Negroid Caucasian differences in intelligence or any other phenotype, and 2. The book was published after Rushton had already published his work on RK theory of racial differences. However, the association between this book and Rushton is highly effective in producing a negative evaluation of the book because of Rushton's current persona non grata status as a theorist of racial differences. The next section of the Lerner and von I article is entitled Genetic Determinism as Sociobiology's Key to Interdisciplinary Integration. Implicit in this juxtaposition is the implication that the authors in my edited volume accept the thesis of genetic determinism, and indeed, at the end of this section, Lerner and von I lump my edited work together with the work of a number of other sociobiological writers who are said to believe that anatomy is destiny, that environmental influences are fictional, and that the social world does not interact with human genes, unquote. Scholars connected to evolutionary perspectives on human behavior genetics have commonly been branded genetic determinists in this highly politicized literature. Such accusations are a staple of Gouldian rhetoric and are a major theme of Lewontin's overtly political "not in our genes." I rather doubt that any of the writers discussed in this section of Lerner and von Eye's paper can accurately be described as genetic determinists. Indeed, Degler accurately summarizes recent evolutionary thinking in the social sciences as characterized by a full recognition of the power and influence of environment on culture. However, I would like to stress here that this is a completely inaccurate characterization of my writings, and is difficult to suppose that Lerner was unaware of this. Two of my contributions to the edited volume are greatly concerned with environmental and cultural differences on behavior and underdetermination of behavior by the genes. In particular, my theoretical perspective as described in Chapter 1 of the edited volume takes a strong position supporting the importance of developmental plasticity and affirming the importance of contextual influences on human development. And in both of these sections of my paper, I cite Richard Lerner's work. However, Lerner and von Eye are seemingly careful to avoid actually describing what I have written. Instead, their strategy is that of innuendo and guilt by association. By placing my edited book at the end of a section devoted to writers who are supposedly genetic determinists, they manage to imply that all of the writers in the volume are genetic determinists. Unfortunately, such innuendo is typical in attacks on evolutionary perspective and human behavior. The point here is that there is every reason to suppose that a major impetus for these attacks is an attempt to combat anti-Semitism. Lerner begins his preface to Final Solutions, Biology, Prejudice, and Genocide with an emotionally retching portrait of his childhood surrounded by stories of Nazi atrocities. Quote, "As a Jewish boy growing up in Brooklyn in the late 1940s and early 1950s, I could not escape Hitler. He, Nazis, the Gestapo, Auschwitz were everywhere," unquote. Lerner recreates a conversation with his grandmother describing the fate of some of his relatives at the hands of the Nazis. He asks why the Nazis hated the Jews, and his grandmother responds by saying, "Just because." Lerner states, quote, In the time that has passed since that afternoon in my grandmother's apartment, I have learned, and increasingly so as the years go by, how deeply I was affected by these early lessons about Nazi genocide. I now understand that much of my life has been shaped by my attempts to go beyond the answer of just because, unquote. Lerner states that he chose to study developmental psychology because the nature-nurture issue is central to this field, and therefore central to his attempt to combat anti-Semitism. Lerner thus apparently actually chose his career in an effort to advance Jewish interests in the social sciences. In the preface, Lerner cites his intellectual influences virtually the entire lists of predominantly Jewish developmental psychobiologists and anti-sociobiologists mentioned above, including Gottlieb, Gold, Kamen, Lewontin, Rose, Schneiderlia, and Tobach. As is common among Jewish historians, Lerner dedicates the book to his family, quote, "To all my relatives, your lives will not be forgotten," unquote. Clearly there is no pretense that this book is a dispassionate scientific endeavor to develop a theory of behavioral development or to come to grips with an ethnically based social conflict. The central message of Lerner's book is that there is a possible causal chain linking Darwinism to an ideology of genetic determinism, to the legitimization of the status quo as a biologic imperative, to negatively evaluating individuals with inferior genotypes, to eugenics, and finally to destruction of those with inferior genes. The storyline is said to have played out in several historical instances, including the massacre of Native Americans and the Ottoman genocide of Armenians, and most particularly in the Holocaust. It is nowhere mentioned that an ideology of genetic determinism is hardly a necessary condition for genocide, since there are a great many historical examples of genocide in societies where Darwin was unknown, including the annihilation of the Amorites and the Midianites by the Israelites described in the Tanakh, examples that are ignored by Lerner. Nor is there evidence that, for example, the Ottoman Turks were acquainted with Darwin or had views, scientific or otherwise, about the genetic determination of behavior. Lerner's agenda is to discredit evolutionary thinking because of its association with Nazism. The logic is as follows. Although Lerner acknowledges that genetic determinists need not be racist, and that they may even have enlightened political views, he states that genetic determinism is an ideology that can be used to give scientific credence to their viewpoint. Quote, the doctrine of biological determinism exists ready for co-optation by proponents of such a political movement, unquote. Sociobiology, as the most recent incarnation of the scientific justification of genetic determinism, must be intellectually discredited. Quote, contemporary sociobiologists are certainly not neo-Nazis. They do not in any way advocate genocide, and may not even espouse conservative political views. Nevertheless, the correspondence between their ideas, especially those regarding women, and those of the Nazi theorists is more than striking, unquote. Lerner correctly describes the Nazi ideology as essentially an ideology of group impermeability. Quote, the belief that the world may be divided unequivocally into two major groups, an in-group comprising those possessing the best features of human existence, and an out-group comprising the worst features of human existence. There can be no crossing overs between these groups because of blood or genes divide them, unquote. Similarly, Lewontin, in his foreword to Lerner's book, states that, quote, whatever the generating forces that keep nationalism alive, they must in the end assert the unchanging and unchangeable nature of social identity. Exploiters and exploited alike share in the consciousness of a cultural and biological heritage that marks out indelible group boundaries that transcend human historical development, unquote. Lerner and Lewontin condemn sociobiology because they suppose that sociobiology could be used to justify such a result. However, the evolutionary theory of social identity processes developed as the basis of theory of anti-Semitism implies just the opposite. Although humans appear to be biologically predisposed towards in-group, out-group conflict, there is no reason whatever to suppose that group membership or group permeability itself is genetically determined. That is, there is no reason to suppose that there is a genetic imperative that societies must be organized around impermeable groups, and indeed, prototypical Western societies have not been organized in this manner. Social identity research indicates that hostility towards outgroups occurs even in randomly composed groups, and even in the absence of between-group competition. The outstanding feature of Judaism has been that it has steadfast raised barriers between Jews as an in-group and the surrounding society as an out-group. But though it is reasonable to suppose that Jews are genetically more prone to ethnocentrism than Western peoples, the erection of cultural barriers between Jews and Gentiles is a critical aspect of Judaism as a culture. Moreover, a salient point here is that there is no appreciation in either Lerner or Lewontin of the great extent to which Jews have themselves created impermeable groups in which genetic bloodlines were of the highest importance, in which there were hierarchies of racial purity, and which genetic and cultural assimilation were viewed as anathema. Judaism as a group evolutionary strategy has resulted in societies torn apart by internal conflict between impermeable, competing ethnic groups. Nevertheless, Jewish cultural practices are at least a necessary condition for the group impermeability that has been so central to Judaism as a group evolutionary strategy. It is thus a supreme irony that Lewontin and Lerner should be attempting to combat anti-Semitism by saying that ethnic identification and the permeability of groups are not genetically determined. There are good reasons to suppose that group permeability is not genetically determined, and the evidence reviewed indicates that Jews have been exquisitely aware of this since the origins of Judaism as a group evolutionary strategy. At times, Jewish groups have endeavored to foster an illusion of group permeability in order to minimize anti-Semitism. Although Jews may well be genetically predisposed to form impermeable ethnic groups and resist genetic and cultural assimilation, there is little reason to suppose that this is genetically determined. Indeed, the evidence reviewed in Chapter 7 and 8 indicates the central importance of several cultural and environmental factors for the success of Judaism as a relatively impermeable group evolutionary strategy. Intensive socialization for a Jewish in-group identity and group allegiance, the great variety of mechanisms of separation, and the cultural invention of the hereditary, priestly, and Levitical classes. Moreover, the removal of intensive cultural separatism, characteristics of Judaism in traditional societies, have resulted in long-term decline of diaspora Judaism. As a result, the contemporary Western world, Jewish groups often go to great lengths to discourage intermarriage and to develop greater Jewish consciousness and commitment among Jews. This attempt to reestablish the cultural supports for Jewish identification and non-assimilation often involves the suggestion of a return to Jewish religious belief and ritual as the only way to stave off the long-term assimilative pressures of contemporary Western societies. So that's the end of that paragraph. So it seems like, on some level, Jews understand that National Socialism was a way in which Gentiles were rejecting Western civilization and the laws that were normal during that time of accepting Jews and viewing society in much more of a racialized lens and setting up government policy so that the German main ethnic group could exclude the Jewish ethnic group from dominating their society. And that's what has the Jews so butthurt, the fact that the Germans under Hitler were able to, in a way, emulate the Jewish strategy of favoring one group over another and dominating over the other in that society. And that's why they go so crazy about Nazism, because it actually worked. Things of the past of just tolerating Jews and confining them to ghettos and allowing them to lend money just gave them power. And Hitler was really the only person that came along and stopped them from doing such practices and kicked them out of all areas of life that could give the Jews an advantage over the Gentiles. A common thread of this chapter has been scientific skepticism and what one might term scientific obscurantism have been tools in combating scientific theories one dislikes for deeper reasons. Thus, the Boasian demand for the highest standards of proof for generalizations about culture and for establishing a role for genetic variation in the development of individual differences coincided with the acceptance of an anti-theory of culture that was fundamentally in opposition to attempts to develop classifications and generalizations in the field. Similarly, the dynamic contextualist theoretical perspective, though rejecting behavioral genetics and evolutionary theorizing about human development as failing to meet scientific standards of proof, has proposed a theory of development in which the relation between genes and environment is an extremely complex and ultimately unanalyzable fusion. Moreover, a major theme of Chapter 5 is that the radical skepticism of the Frankfurt School of Social Research was self-consciously directed at deconstructing universalist, assimilatory theories of society as a homogeneous, harmonious whole. Scientific skepticism regarding politically sensitive issues has also been a powerful trend in the writings of S.J. Gold. Carl Degger says of Gold that, quote, an opponent of sociobiology like Gold does indeed emphasize the interaction between biology and environment, but at the same time he persistently resists investigations of the role of each of the interacting elements, unquote. Jensen states that Gold's work on intelligence testing, quote, I believe that he has succeeded brilliantly in obfuscating all the important open questions that actually concern today's scientists, unquote. The type of intellectual work is aimed at precluding the development of general theories of human behavior in which genetic variation plays an independently analyzable causative role in producing adaptive behavior. We have seen how R.C. Lewontin has linked theories of behavioral development with Marxist political ideology. As do Lerner and Gold, Lewontin advocates theories proposing that nature consists of extremely complex dialectical interactions between organism and environment. Lewontin rejects reductionist scientific methods such as quantitative behavioral genetics or the use of analysis of variance procedures because they inevitably oversimplify real processes in their use of averages. The result is a hyper-purism that settles for nothing less than an absolute certainty, absolute correct methodology, epistemology, and ontology. In developmental psychology, such a program would ultimately lead to rejection of all generalizations, including those relating to the average effects of environments. Because each individual has a unique set of genes and is constantly developing in a unique and constantly changing environment, God himself would probably have difficulty providing a deterministic amount. God himself would probably have a difficulty providing a deterministic account of individual development, and in any case, such an account must necessarily, like a Boasian theory of culture, be deferred long into the future. By adapting this philosophy of science, Lewontin is able to discredit attempts by scientists to develop theories and generalizations, and thus, in the name of scientific rigor, avoid the possibility of any politically unacceptable scientific findings. Segerstrali notes that, while using this theory as a weapon against biological views in the social sciences, Lewontin's own empirical research in population biology has remained firmly within the reductionist tradition. Gold and Lewontin's critique of adaptationism may also be viewed as an exemplar of the skeptical thrust of Jewish intellectual activity. Acknowledging the existence of adaptations, the argument effectively problematizes the status of any putative adaptation. Gold then goes from the possibility that any putative adaptation may simply be a spandrel that, like the architectural form from which its name derives, results from structural constraints imposed by true adaptations, to the remarkable suggestion that the human mind must be viewed as a collection of such non-functional spandrels. As noted above, Gold's larger agenda is to convince his audience that the human brain has not evolved to solve adaptive problems, a view anthropologist Vincent Surich has termed behavioral creationism. Indeed, fascination with the slippery rhetoric of Gold in Lewontin Spandrel's article has resulted in an entire volume of essays dedicated to dissecting the writing style of this essay. Scientific skepticism is a powerful approach, since a very basic feature of science is an openness to criticism and a requirement that arguments be supported with evidence. As E.O. Wilson notes, quote, by adopting a narrow criterion of publishable research, Lewontin freed himself to pursue a political agenda unencumbered by science. He adopted the relativist view that accepted truth, unless based on ineluctable fact, is no more than a reflection of dominant ideology and political power, unquote. Similar themes with similar motivations characterizes the ideologies of the Frankfurt School and postmodernism discussed in Chapter 5. Nevertheless, Lewontin portrays his ideologically inspired efforts as deriving from a concern for scientific rigor. Quote, we demand canons of evidence and logic that are formal and without reference to empirical content, the logic of statistical inference, and the power of replicating experiments, the distinction between observations and causal claims, unquote. The result is a thoroughgoing skepticism, for example, all theories of the origins of the sexual division of labor are said to be speculative. Similarly, Gold rejects all accounts of the empirical data in the area of intelligence testing, but provides no alternatives. As Jensen notes, Gold offers no, and this is a quote, Gold offers no alternative ideas to account for all of these well-established observations. His mission in this area appears entirely nihilistic, unquote. Similarly, Buss et al. Note that whereas the adaptationalist perspective in psychology has resulted in a rich body of theoretical predictions and in numerous confirmatory empirical studies, Gold's ideas of spandrels and acceptations has resulted in no theoretical predictions and no empirical research. Again, the mission seems to be what one might term nihilistic and anti-science. As with Boas, Lewontin holds biologically oriented research on humans to an extremely rigorous standard, but is remarkably lenient in the standards required to prove biology has very little influence. Lewontin claims, for example, that, quote, nearly all the biology of gender is bad science, unquote. But on the following page, he states an obvious truth that, quote, the human being is the nexus of a large number of weakly acting causes, unquote. And Lewontin states without an argument or reference that, quote, no one has ever found a correlation between cognitive ability and brain size, unquote. At this writing, there have been at least 26 published studies on 39 independent samples showing a correlation of approximately 0.20 between head circumference and IQ. There have also been at least 6 published studies showing a correlation of approximately 0.40 between brain size and IQ using the more accurate technique of magnetic resonance imaging to directly scan the brain. Given this body of findings, it is at least misleading to make such a statement, although Lewontin would presumably argue that none of those studies reach acceptable levels of scientific proof. Franz Boas would be proud. And that is the end of Chapter 2. We will be going into Chapter 3, and I'll hopefully have this out within Chapter 3 within a few days. These chapters are going to be much longer in the future, and it's going to take more time to complete these. I'll possibly reveal or post these chapters in smaller parts, just so maybe you guys could have a little bit more to go on. But that concludes it for today, and I'm signing off.